Autofocus. Understanding autofocus. Every new photographer needs to master how to use their autofocus on their new digital SLR. So let's begin with the basics of autofocus. Autofocus is the automatic principle of the camera working out the distance it is that your subject is away from the camera. Now, the process to activate autofocus is known as the half press. So what you would do is when you half press your shutter release button, you now activate the autofocus mode. This then sees the camera start to search and work out the distance it is that your subject is away from the camera. Now, once it's locked on, you should see a visual indicator or hear an audio beep from your digital SLR. Once you see or hear this, this means that you're ready to take the photograph. So when you fully depress the shutter release button, you should now see a nice, sharp, in focus photograph of your subject. So that is the basic principle of how autofocus does work. But there actually is two types of autofocus. We have single autofocus and then we have continuous autofocus. So what is the difference between single autofocus and continuous autofocus? Well, single autofocus basically records a set distance your subject is away from the camera, and it locks this set distance into the memory of the camera. Whereas continuous autofocus, on the other hand, that does not. It constantly keeps looking for the subject. So let me give you a working example. Let's say that we wanted to photograph a person stood in front of a flyer background, and let's say we used single autofocus. Then what happens is when we half press the button, single autofocus will work out the distance it is that the person is away from the camera. Now that distance is logged into the memory of the camera. So this now allows us to recompose the shot, because remember, we already know how far the person is away from the camera. So the single autofocus allows us to recompose the shot without any problems, because our person is always going to be in focus no matter what, because they're at a set distance. However, continuous autofocus does not work like this, because if we've done the same thing with continuous autofocus and we try to recompose our shot, what would happen is instead of focusing on the person still, the continuous autofocus would now focus on the background. So let me give you an example of continuous focus and where you would use it. Continuous autofocus is brilliant for sports photographers, those who photograph soccer, horse racing, basketball, boxing, etc., etc. Here's how continuous autofocus works. When you half press your shutter release button in continuous autofocus mode, your camera will lock onto the distance it is that your subject is at. Now, when your subject starts to move and you move with your subject, if your subject comes closer to you, then the camera will readjust its focus in order to keep that person in focus. If your subject moves away from you, then continuous autofocus will refocus its focus in order to keep the person moving away from you in focus. So as you can understand now, continuous autofocus, no matter what, will constantly keep adjusting its focus for a moving subject. So to finish with, continuous autofocus is used on moving subjects, and single autofocus is used on still subjects. So I would use single autofocus on product photography, such as photographing, aftershave, perfume, etc. Subjects that just don't move. Whereas continuous autofocus, I would use on moving subjects such as soccer players, basketball, boxes, horse racing, etc. Rally sports. So there you go. Now you have a better understanding of what autofocus is with your digital SLR.